Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello, I'm Gary, and this is That's English.
That's English. But do you know what English is like?
I don't understand what you mean.
Que si sabes cómo es el inglés. Well, English is a language made up of 3% of Latin, 60% of Old English, and 30% of French.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know we had so many words from French.
Yes, and there are some curious cases. Por ejemplo, ox significa buey, pero cuando nos referimos al buey cocinado, entonces utilizamos la palabra vif, que es de origen francés.
That's true. Y pig, cerdo, cocinado, se dice pork. Pero, ¿cuál es la razón?
You'll know after you've watched the documentary. It's about the influence of other languages on English.
Pero antes vamos a explicaros el significado de algunas palabras nuevas que aparecerán.
Tribe significa tribu.
Missionary significa misionero.
Publish significa publicar.
Y entry, entrada. En el documental, voces o términos en un diccionario.
Now we're going to ask you the following questions about the documentary. Ready? The first question. Which of the following languages have had an influence on English? Russian, Latin, Celtic, French, Arabic, or Germanic languages?
Why is the Oxford Dictionary so important for the English language?
Ready? Then let's watch our out
And about.
English, part of the Germanic family of languages, first started to be spoken in the southeast of England, and it had influences from all the peoples who had invaded the island. When London was founded by the Romans with the name of Londinium, the area was inhabited by Celtic tribes that spoke a Celtic language similar to modern Welsh.
But the Celts and the Romans contributed very few words to English, although Britain comes from the Roman word Britannia, land of the Britons.
In the 5th century, Britannia was invaded by Germanic tribes, Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, whose languages were the basis of the English language.
By the year 1000, the country was known as Engleland, or Land of the Angles, and their language as English.
But Latin, the language of the Romans, hadn't been totally forgotten. At that time, it was the language of learning in Europe, and it had been reintroduced into Britain by Christian missionaries.
In 1066, the Normans invaded the island, and for the next 300 years, all the kings of England spoke French. Norman culture, which was more sophisticated, had a great impact in England. The hospital church of St. Bartholomew, built by the Normans, is a good example of this.
In the 13th and 14th centuries, an educated person had to speak 3 languages: English, which was still the language of the people, French, which was the language of the court, and Latin, which was the language of the church and of learning.
But in 1387, Chaucer wrote his masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, in English. This book represented the definitive triumph of English.
Nowadays, the greatest authority on the English language is probably Oxford University Press, which has been publishing the Oxford English Dictionary since the last century. It is the equivalent of the Dictionary of the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language, that is, the Oxford English Dictionary, is a dictionary you have to refer to whenever you have doubts about English words or expressions. New words are constantly being added to it. We interviewed Leslie Brown, editor of the new shorter Oxford English Dictionary, and asked her if there's anything in Great Britain similar to the Spanish Royal Academy.
No, there isn't. At the same time as the Spanish Academy was founded, there were discussions in Britain as whether to start a similar organisation, but it never happened. And then in the 19th century, when the Oxford English Dictionary began to be produced, it came to be regarded very much as the equivalent of a national dictionary, though Oxford University Press finances it itself. There's no state support for the Oxford English Dictionary.
What criteria do you follow in the rejection or incorporation of new words and expressions?
We look for the number of times we have a word recorded in use, the period of time over which it is used in our records, and the variety of sources or people who are using it. So it's a mixture of all those criteria. We have hundreds of millions of examples in our files to look at and see how often and by whom a word is being used.
How many entries are there in the Oxford Dictionary?
About 500,000, 500,000.
In the offices of the Oxford English Dictionary, there is an interesting museum presided over by the portrait of the first editor of the Oxford Dictionary. It has some old machines and extremely unusual print fonts. They're all part of the history of the English language.
Was that difficult? You know it's not easy to understand everything. But if you understand the main information, that's enough.
Do you remember the first question? It was, which of the following languages have had an influence on the English language? Russian, Latin, Celtic, Arabic, French, or Germanic languages? The answer is
Celtic, Germanic languages, Latin, and French.
The next question was, why is the Oxford Dictionary so important for the English language? Let's see.
In the 19th century, when the Oxford English Dictionary began to be produced, it came to be regarded very much as the equivalent of a national dictionary.
It's the equivalent of the National Dictionary.
And now, as usual, we're going to watch our play it again. It's about a great man who did a lot for the English language.
A man? Well, you'll see.
No.
What's the matter, darling?
I can't find the right words.
What words?
Well, I want to say that Hamlet was reading a book when Ophelia arrived, but I don't know how to.
Well, just say Hamlet was reading a book when Ophelia arrived.
Oh, yes, of course. It's not that simple, you know.
What are you writing now?
Hamlet, Prince of Denmark.
How boring.
Boring? The history of Denmark boring? Hamlet represents human doubt.
You should write a love story. The other day I was at the market and I heard the story of two lovers. I think the names were Romeo and Juliet. Just imagine, Juliet was at the balcony above her garden when suddenly a shadow appeared. Oh, Romeo, Romeo.
Romeo and Juliet. What nonsense. I'm a genius. I don't write love stories and stuff like that.
Well, it's much more interesting than the life of that Hanley.
Hamlet.
And better paid.
We have a lot more money than we need.
But not as much as the Duke and Duchess of Orange. I've heard they're looking for a new palace.
The Duke and Duchess of Orange. What a pair of idiots. Always speaking French. Pork, lamb, vichyssoise. They're destroying our language. What do they want a new palace for?
Well, either you are important or you aren't, my dear William. To be or not to be, that is the question.
To be or not to be. To be or not to be. Those are the words I was looking for. To be or not to be. That is the question. That is the question.
Whether 'tis nobler in the mind.
Whether 'tis nobler
In the mind.
in the mind. My dear Yorick, one day these words will be an example of good English. I was talking to Yorick, not to you. Funny, wasn't it? But it wasn't Shakespeare's wife who wrote his famous plays.
Well, who knows? Behind a great man, there's always a greater woman.
According to the Bible, man was created first.
Well, when someone wants to create a masterpiece, they always do a sketch first. He dicho que cuando alguien quiere hacer una obra maestra, como yo, primero tiene que hacer un boceto, como tú.
And now let's watch a summary of everything we've learned in this unit.
In this unit, we've learned about the origin of some English words.
Words that come from other languages like sherry, which comes from Spanish, or tea, which comes from Chinese.
We've also learned new ways of making comparisons. For example,
I've written a few more books than him.
and finally, we've revised how to talk about two actions in the past.
We were driving along, then we stopped at a petrol station.
So this is the end of the program. See you in the next unit of That's English. Gary.
Oh, goodbye.
What are you doing?
I'm writing the history of English.
Hey, Gary, you are Gary Piquet, not Shakespeare.
Shakespeare didn't know he was a genius, just like me.
Okay, if you insist.
What?
Escribe. La tontería fascina más que la inteligencia. La inteligencia tiene límites. La tontería no.
In English, Sarah, please. In English.
Okay?